Yep.
3, 2, 1. Welcome, everybody. We are on Exercises Medicine, episode number 17. And today, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to have Andrea Irvine, who is the sports dietitian for the Drexel Dragons here at Drexel University. We'll talk a little bit about Andrea's story, her background, how she got into the field of sports nutrition, a little bit about her job, and as I think you'll see, the conversation really moves forward and we talk about a lot of topics. So we hope you enjoy this episode of the podcast. So without further ado, Andrea, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So absolutely. So one of the things I think is really helpful to kind of get us started is a lot of people that we have on this podcast, we talk about really how you got your start, right? So maybe if I think, starting back from before you ever even thought you wanted to get into nutrition, were you an athlete? Can you talk a little about your history and sort of how you got into the field of sports nutrition?
Yes, and this is a very common question that I get. Mm-hmm. So I was growing up, I was an active kid. I was active in high school, and then I had the honor to play Division I field hockey at the University of Delaware. So I thought I was going to be a professional field hockey player.
Sure.
And then I got really interested in communication and interviewing and marketing. So I got a degree in communication and a minor in English. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. But upon graduation, I got offered, I knew I still wanted to be somehow in sports. So I got offered a job at Villanova University as an assistant coach.
Gotcha. In field hockey?
In field hockey. So my career as a dietitian is actually a second career for me.
Okay.
So when I was at Villanova, I would coach. I would also work with some of our U.S. teams, like as an assistant, a volunteer assistant coach, coming to trainings, things like that. And then I was teaching as an adjunct at Immaculata University, and I knew I started to feel like, okay, I want to do something else with my life. I loved coaching, but I wanted to do something else. And while I was teaching very basic nutrition, like, health wellness classes. And I thought, this is what I should do.
Yeah.
So I had a conversation with somebody that shall remain nameless.
Okay.
About this and about applying to a program. And they sat me down and said, you will never make it in the field of nutrition.
No kidding.
Yep. I was like, wait, what? Because I've always been surrounded by people who have told me what I can do.
Sure.
So this is really one of the first times I've experienced a lot of pushback. And they told me, I think I was like 28 at the time, and they told me, you're too old. This is a lot of work to get into the field of nutrition. Definitely, this is not for you. So
just to back up, so you're a college athlete. Correct. At University of Delaware. Mm-hmm. You're majoring in communication and English. And upon graduation, you go to Villanova, yep. Right? Teach some courses, go to Immaculata, teach some courses.
Teaching at Immaculata while I was coaching at Villanova.
Coaching at Villanova.
That was my job. Like I was a collegiate field hockey coach, so we did like club stuff, and like I said, there's a lot of U.S. Programming and grassroots that I was able to be involved in, and I knew that and doing that in the recruiting trail, I was thinking like, what should I pursue next?
Sure. Gotcha. Okay. So I guess the question is so then why nutrition, right?
Yeah. So I was really interested when I was teaching these very, 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 very basic health and wellness classes, just how that would... no one had ever talked to me about nutrition before. So for me to be reading these books and texts and sparking a conversation and the interactions that I had with the students at Immaculata and then applying it to what I was doing as a coach just really was very intriguing to me. And I said, this is it. I am going to go and get my master's degree in nutrition. And it wasn't even about sports nutrition. I have to be honest with you. I had been involved with sports so heavily for such a long time that I actually was getting burned out of sport. And
Gotcha.
it's when you're a coach and you're recruiting and it's a lot.
So a couple things that you said that really like I'm like in awe of. One is other people that we've had on this podcast, usually there's like to get to the never again moment, what I call, like a never again moment, which is like, this is like for you, it was like, this is the thing. This is what I want to do with my life, right? Very clear. You're very clear on that. Is a lot of people have somebody in their lives that doubt them or think that they're not able to achieve that task, right? And it's just kind of interesting to hear that. The other thing that you said that really, to me, is really interesting is you were University of Delaware's Division I program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
You were a Division I field hockey player. Mm-hmm. And you didn't have any type of nutrition guidance or when you were going through the program?
No, we did not, actually.
Wow.
There was no, I don't want to date myself on here.
Sure. That's okay.
But when I was there, my teammates and I am still close with a lot of them. We talk about, oh my gosh, wouldn't this have been so useful to have this information? I know the sports dietitian, Kelly Rossi, I'm going to give her a shout out at University of Delaware now. She's doing an excellent job, and just their whole sports performance staff, like the things that they have, we would have loved to have when we were there. And it makes me proud as an alum to see the progression, but we definitely did not have that type of education and support when we were there.
Yeah. So then I guess it comes down to part awareness, right? A lot of that goes on, I think, at the professional levels. And so it just to me, it was interesting that, you're a college level athlete. And just how much the world has changed, and however long.
Be careful.
However long that was, right?
Yeah,
Thinking about that,
yeah,
it's something that's changed dramatically over relatively a short period of time.
Yes,
right?
Agreed.
So you're dating yourself, but at the same token,
yeah.
I think
And
we're in the standard deviation of age.
Yes,
I'll put it to you that way.
yeah. I'm fine to say it. I was teasing. I was at University of Delaware 98 to 2002 is when I graduated. So it's just when we started to get like flip phones. We still had the phone at our house that we would use. So we just that whole. All of that was new, and we had athletic trainers, and they have a great athletic training program, but it wasn't. And we had a team doctor who was fantastic, but we didn't have, there was no sports psych, there was no nutrition, there wasn't a training table, there wasn't any of those extra things that I think most mid-major and above have or are starting to get now.
Right. Yeah. It's something that has, nowadays you think about all these different components of wellness, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. And so sort of thinking about your journey to deciding that this is what I want to do with my life, right? So then I guess in spite of the fact that someone had basically told you that you couldn't do it, and that you would never be good at it. Here you are, right? You're So I guess, from that moment, what happened? When did you go to grad school?
So at that moment, I was so mad, and my competitive juices really kicked into high gear. I was like, oh, really? You just watch. You watch out. And now I wasn't obviously applying to their program. So I think I was on a recruiting trip at coaching, and I was talking to Denise Zelenak at Drexel, who's the Drexel head field hockey coach, and I was telling her, she's a good friend of mine. She knew me as a player and then as a colleague, and she was like, we have nutrition at Drexel, and actually we're looking for a grad assistant. would this be something that you'd be interested in? Because I'm thinking like, also, how am I going to pay for this?
Sure, yeah.
So she said, would you take, I know it's a demotion in kind of, going from a first assistant to a grad assistant. It's not really the way and maybe demotion's not the best word, but that's not typically the trajectory is grad assistant, second assistant, first assistant, head coach. So I was going from a first assistant to a grad assistant. I mean, and Denise and Nikki never treated me any differently. Right. And so I left Villanova and I came to Drexel and I coached at Drexel while I got my master's degree in nutrition here at Drexel. And that was awesome. And it was also probably one of the hardest things I ever had to do because I did not have a science background. So, I was taking science classes at, almost 30 years old with undergraduates,
Sure, yeah.
So I'm taking all these classes just to get into the program. I mean, I fought really hard to even get in and to learn. But as an adult learner, I think that was also an advantage for me with maturity and
definitely
and grit and all of that. So once I completed my degree, and I also was able to work with Nairi Dardarian while I was here for the Center for Nutrition and Performance, but it wasn't called that, and I forget what it was called at the time, and under Dr. Stella Volpe. So we were part of this, group, but we were basically, when we were here at the time, I was the second class in that group. We were just doing kind of like weight loss management for staff. So really had nothing, even at that time, we weren't really doing much at all with the teams and sports nutrition.
Sports. Gotcha.
Yeah, even while I was here. Mm-hmm. So when I graduated, then, and for people who are not familiar with how the pathway to become a dietitian is, you do an undergraduate or a graduate degree. Now it's becoming master's degree required. So we're transitioning, our profession is transitioning into that. But and then you have to do a dietetic internship. And at the time they were separate. Now there's like all these different bridge programs and there's all these different programs. But at the time it was usually a 9 to 10 month program, 1,200 supervised clinical practice hours, and you paid for that. So not only did you just go through and pay for, your degree, then you're paying to be in this internship to essentially work for free. So it's a lot,
right.
And
you'll pay us to work.
Yeah, right. It's a really good concept. And then when you get experience in food service, community, clinical, and they set up your rotations. And that's how it was set up for me. During that time, I was thinking that I was transitioning out of sport. So when I graduated with my degree here from Drexel, I was like, well, I guess this is the last time I'm coaching.
Right.
Last time I'm going to be part of a team, which was really difficult because it was a really big part of my identity, being a part of sport. If anybody's ever been a part of sports, you know it is an identity. It's a tough transition because you're like, well, who am I without this? Because did this make me interesting? Am I going to be interesting without this? I mean,
right.
It's very common, more common than you would think.
Definitely, yeah. I played high school and college football, and the same kind of thing was, I went back and coached for a while, and when I was getting my personal training certification, and you kind of like finding the educational side of things, and then the demands of the graduate program sort of occupy all of your time. And so then, you're trying to balance everything, and it's very, very difficult. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, just because I think it's really helpful. So when you were a graduate assistant, right, there was a pro to that, right? Because from the hierarchy of going from graduate assistant to, what was it, third assistant, second assistant,
whatever,
right, up the trajectory.
Usually.
When you're in the grad program and you had that graduate assistantship, did Drexel help pay for some of your tuition 100%, or no?
100%.
Yes.
Yeah. So It was, and when I said demotion, I mean, maybe that wasn't, it's just not, most people are going to get a job out of college, or at least how it used to be. You would graduate as an undergraduate, try to get into a grad program where you can start then your mentorship with the coaching staff to then develop into a coach, where I kind of went from, I was a player to a first assistant,
Right.
then to a graduate assistant, and then out.
But that was worth it for you because the tuition was paid for, right?
100%. And Denise and Nikki are fantastic and were fantastic. I was a goalkeeper in college, and I was the goalkeeping coach. So the respect level was always there. So it was a great situation for me because I was able to get that paid for, but it was also really difficult because while school was being paid for, I was I wasn't living at home. I was living with my now husband, who was a coach, and, we had mortgage payments, car payments. So I would nanny. My day would start at like 4:45, and I'd be at practice. So we'd train from 6 to 8:30 a.m. And then some days I would go to my nanny job. Other days I would go right to the office, work in the office for a while. And then I would go to, my classes were at night. So I'd be like nannying during the day and trying to study, and then going to classes till like 9 o'clock at night. Classes were 6 to 9 for graduates at that time. So.
And then back up the next morning.
And then back up the next morning. It was a real struggle for me.
Yeah.
And plus I'm like learning all these new things, and I have to train my brain to start thinking much differently in more of a scientific way, and ask different questions, and learning literally all these new things.
Well, I'll tell you this, there is one thing that I've noticed as being a faculty member teaching classes, is that a lot of the student athletes are built for that. They're built for handling high expectations. And
Yes.
I've seen that pretty consistently. So I'm sure when you're going through it, right, it's very miserable.
Lots of tears.
You're trying to figure out, do I give this up? And then you start really thinking about, is this made for me? And then you sort of, take a day after pouting, and you kind of come back to things, and you say, you know what, I think I could do this. What's the very first thing that I can do, right?
Yeah.
And you kind of have like a play, like the way I think of it is it's the mentality like you're playing from behind, right?
Totally.
And then you kind of just like throw the game plan out the door,
Yes.
like we're surviving the next possession, right? And
Yep.
so you kind of get into that competitive mindset, and then you're just locked in, and to a certain degree, nothing could defeat you. So it's I can't speak to your story in going through that, but similarly, when I was in graduate school, I had a very similar type of experience where you're just trying, like the bills are piling up, and you're like, well, I'm trying to go to school, trying to work overnights, and you're just sort of like, all right, how do I survive this? But the good thing is that I did not come up with this quote, but it's a quote that I really love, and I don't know who came up with it. And if you search for it, you might not necessarily find an author for it. So I'm glad to take credit for it. But it's that tough times don't last, tough people do, right? And really thinking that tough people can really withstand anything, right? And that period of your life, although very difficult and challenging, you had a lot to fight for, it sounds like, right?
Yeah.
Not only for your family,
Yep.
and your husband was making sacrifices, right?
Yeah,
So
everybody
you can go to
was.
school.
Yep.
Do you have kids at the time?
We did not have kids. We weren't even married at the time. But
Okay.
I would lean on my parents for things, and
Yep.
and just support even. And they'd sit there and watch me like cry at the table because I didn't know how to do these statistical analyses or whatever it was, or this chemistry or whatever it was. And I'm like, oh my gosh. But I am very fortunate in the sense that I have a great family support, and my husband, who is my husband, but my boyfriend, I guess at the time, it's weird to call him that, but he was really supportive. And as a coach, same thing. He was like, you can do this. Like, what are you doing? So I got those pep talks. I got those pep talks a lot. And it was definitely, my athletic experiences were kicking in, and just having the grit and resilience of like, okay, I can do this. Take a breath.
Yeah.
You got it. You can do this.
There's a lot of parallels to life, I think, with sports.
100%.
For sure, right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you made it through.
Yeah,
now,
me too.
We work together, and we're good friends now. So I think So you make it through the master's degree.
Yeah.
And
right into the
then
internship.
You're expecting that, all right, I'm getting ready to graduate, go to this internship, and my life as a field hockey coach might be transitioning away from a sport that you've known for a good number of years in your life.
Yes.
So what happened next?
So I did my internship and I got married during my internship, which is a little bit crazy. But I was, again, older student. I was able to do this. So we got married and my husband took a job. He was coaching at men's soccer at Penn and he took a job at Kean University up in northern New Jersey. So once I finished my internship, I also was like, well, I guess I'm done with sports and I'm going to go right into the clinical setting. I'm going to go make a difference because your clinicals and in your internship, you're really just shadowing. You're not really, you don't really have the full responsibility and the weight of the position as somebody in that position being paid for that position. So I was really like, okay, I am out of sport. And it took a lot of even just talking through myself of and getting to a point where I'm like, okay, I'm good with this decision.
Yep.
I'm going to go get a job. So I passed the boards. We moved up to northern New Jersey. I got a job at a hospital and realized very quickly that was not the life for me.
You didn't like the clinical setting?
No, I did not. I learned but I would never go back and change that. And I tell students this all the time because people ask me, students in particular ask me all the time, I don't want to go into clinical. I don't want to go down that road. And I just want to go right into sport. And I didn't really have that option. So for me, maybe I would have taken the just go right into sport option had it been presented to me at that time. But going into the clinical setting taught me so many things. So that I can use now as I'm an adjunct professor here at Drexel. So when I teach classes and I talk about the role of the dietitian in a clinical setting, I can speak that from experience because I lived it. I did it. I mean, we all know that what's sometimes in the textbook I love that. It varies from what the reality is. I mean, we all have to learn, things in a very maybe compartmentalized way. Like this patient we're going to study now has diabetes. And then this patient, the next chapter is kidney disease. And the next chapter is cardiovascular disease. But when you're in the hospital, your patient has all three of those. And you need to figure out what the priority is at that moment in time for that patient. So I learned how to be a part of, I've always been a part of a team, but now as part of the multidisciplinary team with doctors and nurses and therapists. And, I learned so many things from all these people. And then one thing that my clinical manager at the job, one of the things that she had us all do, which at the time we were like, oh, this really stinks. We all just want to be on the same floor every day because, and then we're saying things like, continuity of care, which is true. You build a rapport with the nurses and doctors. But the thing that you forget is that, especially at a smaller hospital, which is where I was working, is that on a vacation day or something, you're the only one, or on the weekend, you're the only one in the hospital. So you better know how to interact and who the doctors and the nurses and how, because sometimes you can just really get familiar and settle into your role or what you're doing. So she really taught me a valuable lesson of she challenged us every day. So we were always switching floors. So I did everything in that hospital. And that was it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work and a lot of learning, but so valuable. And then she also allowed me to have other opportunities, not just inpatient, but outpatient counseling. So I did things working with, mothers and infants and bariatric surgery, all these things. And I was like, okay, I'm not into that. I'm not into this. Or I really liked working. I started a cancer program, education program. So I could tell that I needed more because once I even was able to just be comfortable with being anywhere in the hospital, I needed more. And when you're in an acute setting like a hospital, I mean, if you've ever been in a hospital for anything, it's really stressful because you're in a hospital for something, and
It's not the cleanest place.
it's not the cleanest, and also it's not really the most appropriate time to do education and counseling. And so I just felt like I was just kind of giving some brief education. I mean, I had people that were super interested, and I had other people that were like, just give me medication or I'm good. So it came with challenges just like any other job. And I'm so grateful, beyond grateful, that I actually had that experience for 2 years, because it taught me so many things.
That's great that you bring that up, because a couple things, again, that you said that I think really resonate. Number one is the importance of getting a lot of different experiences. So if for nothing else, you learn, I think, when you work in a hospital, you learn that, like, fiction, if you really try to like draw something out, like the craziest thing you could ever imagine, something even worse than that has probably in real life actually happened in that hospital. Number two, you learn a lot of different patient populations. So you learn a lot about like, well, for example, and if I'm misspeaking, please correct me, but, for someone with kidney, you really got to be careful with like, potassium and sodium and how the kidney processes different fluids. And so, making sure that not only food that you're prescribing, but also like making sure that there's not macro or micronutrients in quantity that these folks are. So there's a lot that goes into what I call it like a sweet science, like kind of like the sweet science is sort of like the real refined, the little subtleties that really go into the profession. The other thing you learn in the hospital, I think, is you learn when you work interprofessionally, you have to learn, how do I convey information to a nurse? How do I convey information to a doctor, to the resident, to a nurse practitioner? And so you have to learn to work with different people who don't necessarily see things the same way that you see them.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
Or they don't think that, anybody else's role is as important as their role, right? Sometimes,
Yes.
right? And that's a big
100%.
challenge that I had. But the other thing too that I think that you bring to your students, and that your students are really, really fortunate to have you, just in general, but I would say also with that kind of experience, is because I'm going to say this on the podcast, but I'll tell you this. I have this thing where I worked in cardiac rehab for like 10 years before getting my PhD. I did it while I was in school. And a lot of times, like there's you had alluded to it with the textbook, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, you can correct me.
Yeah.
But I kind of think that you need to have people that has that real world experience that can bring it into the classroom, because otherwise, effectively, you have folks that are full-time students and they've only ever been a full-time student, right? Good student in high school goes to college, they do well in college, go get the master's degree. They're a graduate assistant, they work as a master's student. Well, might as well get the PhD, because then I could do research and I can become a professor myself. Go do the PhD, got to do a postdoc, go to the postdoc, and then from the postdoc, then you're back into a faculty position. And so that's not everybody's story, but I would say that the thing that I said one time that some folks gave me some pushback about was that, like, well, if you've never actually worked a day in your life, right, like in those environments, it's very hard to bridge the gap, because you only know the academic environment from learning the textbooks and what you learn in class to grad to
I would
postdoc.
agree with that.
So you need people that know. I think there's real life skills that are to be learned, that a lot of times clinical folks like ourselves, right, translate into the classroom, that the students who want to enter these fields have a better appreciation for. It's not just through proxy of what a faculty member regurgitates through materials provided by a textbook, but it's really something that is that has real world application that I think is really helping the students prepare. So I really like that you said that.
Yeah.
Very,
thank
very
you.
helpful.
Well, I see it because I teach, and that's my teaching philosophy too, because sometimes we know that science is always evolving, and some things that we're saying, there were some policies that were actually being changed in real time, but they weren't, it wasn't in the textbook. So I actually had a guest speaker come on. Susan Fuchs came on, who works a lot with lactation, and she was great because, and every week I bring in a guest speaker as part of the lecture of somebody in that field, whether it's a dietitian or just somebody that is related to the area of and the subject that we're learning, because I think that's how strongly I feel about bringing in real world application. And I think my job as a coach and as a educator is to challenge our students to think outside the box and not just regurgitate what is in the text. So
Gotcha.
let's look at real life applications or what's happening in real time and apply it to what we're learning.
So I agree wholeheartedly. And I think it's great that even in the role of an adjunct faculty member, part of your full-time job, right?
Yes.
Thinking of, like, you have time and you're willing to give up some of the time that, because usually I remember when I was an adjunct, I was like really selfish. I just wanted to like do all the lecture because I enjoy teaching it. And so you give up some of the time that you have with the students to bring in experts. That's really great to see. So you finish your time in the clinic.
Yep.
And you decide what's next. Now, this is in northern New Jersey.
Yep.
And Philly's in southern
Correct.
New Jersey, kind of, right?
So, it's,
Mid-southern.
It's, Philly's right outside of South Jersey. So I grew up in South Jersey, which my husband always says is a suburb of Philadelphia.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. So my husband, again, was coaching at Kane, and he was a head coach, and then he got the job as the LaSalle men's soccer head coach. So
Gotcha.
we were actually on vacation when we got the news, and he had to move immediately. So he came and moved in with my parents, actually, and I was still back up in our house up in northern New Jersey. So I do what most of us do. I got on the phone and I called Nairee Dardarian, Stella Volpe. I called all my contacts at Drexel. Those were my and my internship directors, and I said, hey, anybody know of any jobs in the area? I'm moving back to the area and I need a job. So immediately Nairee calls me back and says, did you see the posting? Is this why you're texting or calling? And I said, wow. I don't know what you're talking about. She says, oh my gosh. So she's, sends me the information. I look it up. I see that Drexel University is looking for the first ever sports dietitian so I think, oh my gosh, well, I should absolutely apply to this.
Totally.
And Penn was looking at the same time, but Drexel obviously has my heart.
Yep.
So I applied and went through a very rigorous interview process, and I was really fortunate enough to get the position here. And I think what really helped me with that was my experience. And I'm not saying that everybody needs to have this experience, but for me, what I have found helpful and useful in my role as the sports dietitian is I was a Division I athlete. So I get what it's like, the rigors and the challenges and the greatness of being a Division I athlete.
Yep.
I was also a Division I coach,
Sure.
Collegiate coach, so I understand the pressures to win, to recruit. I know how to recruit, all of those challenges that come with, and greatness and wonderful opportunities that come with being a collegiate coach. And now I can bring to the table my skill set as somebody that understands the complexities and the needs of sports nutrition. And I was really able to combine all of those things. And I think that's what really helps me in my day-to-day job when I'm working with the student athletes or I'm working with the coaches. Those are things that I draw upon my previous experience. So I think that really has helped me.
Yeah, for sure. I'll tell you what, it's just such a great story because usually it's like sort of circuitous and all of a sudden it's like, well, I can tell you what, the alma maters usually like when you're willing to go back to them, right? Because they have fun. And think about it. To a certain, you worked hard, you got through on your own accord, but at the same time, they provided you with the coursework, the training, the education, right?
Yes.
So we used to say this when I was working at Bally Total Fitness, if you really believe in the product, then the product should sell itself. right? If you really believe in the product, you shouldn't be a big sell. And so when applicants like yourself that were Drexel Dragon graduate of the Masters in Nutrition Sciences program, and you had interest in coming back to your own, it's always nice because, number one, you like to think that you provide a program that allows people to do really well. And number two, that you know that person's quality. So they're coming in and they're going to be able to they're going to understand the culture of what it's like. So yeah, you have that from the perspective of being a Division I athlete yourself to coaching and working on the clinical side. So understanding how you fit in other areas. So I guess, thinking about more specifically then about once you get to Drexel, what is your approach because you oversee a lot of athletes.
I do.
All by yourself.
Yep.
And so what's your approach to nutrition? And I think also, what's the difference between nutrition and dietetics?
So really, it's anybody can call themselves a nutritionist.
Okay.
So really anybody. A lot of influencers use that. People that like to sell supplements and things like that. Some of the chiropractic fields, and people can refer to themselves as a nutritionist. But when you are a registered dietitian and you have that credential, so there's also, they're the same, registered dietitian nutritionist, which is what our governing body decided to adapt as well. So you can be an RDN or an RD. You had to go through all of that schooling and education and board certification that I just mentioned. So you got to go, now it's, master's required, internship, and then passing of the board. And then depending on what state you live in, you have to apply for a state licensure. And we are subjected to, as most healthcare professionals, continuing education credits.
Every couple of years.
Ours is 75 every 5 years. Whew. And then for the state, I think it's like 30 or 40 every 2.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to hear because they probably hear these terms used interchangeably, and there really is a difference.
Big difference.
And I think just from a role perspective of like where people are getting their information, whether it's on TikTok or social, like understanding that like the registered dietitian or the RDN is like top of the food chain in the field for the area of nutrition science.
Yes.
And that people who are seeking folks, not that other folks aren't educated, but they're not at the same level of expertise going through that same rigorous process, right?
Correct.
That's not to be elitist. That's just there's a certain threshold of work and evidence and proof that you've done it before you could sit for the boards, right? So it's not like just taking some type of weekend warrior course and labeling yourself as something, right? So
getting a certificate or something. I mean, you have to pass you have to be a board certified to pass an examination, and then within the field of nutrition, there's different areas where you can get additional certification in a specific area.
Gotcha.
So it's a vigorous process. But again, it's just ensuring that we follow evidence-based practices. We are ethical. Science is not an opinion.
Right.
So what we see sometimes when people are influencers, I mean, a lot of our job as dietitians, we are trying to weed out all of the bad information. And we spend a lot of time, unfortunately, dealing with that, and it takes away from what we could be doing because people will come to us, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, athletes, clients, whoever it is, and they'll say, hey, what do you think of this? And sometimes I have to be honest and say, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Sure.
What is that? And then at late night, I'm Googling whatever they ask me, and I'm like, oh, geez. So, a lot of my job too is kind of trying to cut through the noise to get to actual evidence and science.
It's true, yeah. And so, because everybody's got an opinion.
And especially about food. Yeah. So that's what I think is a little bit tricky about being a dietitian as well and working in the field of nutrition is that everybody eats. Mm-hmm. Everybody eats. It's a necessity. So people have very, very strong opinions about what they eat, what they put into their body. So, and maybe not having that background and that understanding that makes it more challenging if they read something, they don't understand what that ingredient is. It may be a name for something else. And,
Sure.
and so, and again, there's just a lot of, which I think we see in a lot of health professions, there's just a lot of noise.
For sure. Yeah, we go. I always, one of the things that in the exercise world that we focus on right now is we need to follow in the footsteps of what some of the legislating bodies have done for licensure for nutrition. We deal with this all the time where an ACSM or an NSCA certified strength and conditioning coach or an exercise physiologist or a clinical exercise physiologist, that is sort of the equivalent in the exercise world. But there's a lot of online weekend workshops, self-home studied course type stuff. And so part of the challenge that we have is really getting the employers to know the difference.
Yes.
And that's really something that is that's been a fight for some time because there are a lot of good information out there. Some of it's even scientifically based, but some of it's a little bit outdated science. I'll put it to you that way.
Yes.
But so if it's okay, one of the things that I think with all the students that you work with, what is your approach to nutrition? So when you have an 18 to 20 something athlete who comes in, right, to the university, whether they are someone that's local, right, the tri-state area, or I know we have some of our athletes. I had one of the students that was from Australia a few years back, right? So we have a lot of international students.
A lot of international students, yeah.
So what is your approach when they come to campus and you're going to start to, that person's going to start to be under your care? What's your approach to working with the students?
Yeah, so usually we're currently developing a playbook right now that we're working with a sports performance team to streamline this process. So depending on the sport, sometimes some of the coaches will have me send like a packet or something ahead of time. We will do during welcome week, we bring the freshmen in and we have a big meeting with them. We introduce them to all their resources, and then we have team meetings with them, group meetings, and just really explaining what we are, who we are, in a very condensed version of kind of what we're doing right now, what our background is, and basically how we can help them be successful not only on the field but obviously in the classroom. And with nutrition, that is definitely going to happen. So typically I will just establish a general rapport with them and explain to them all the different things that I can help them with. And that's even just meeting with them, and it might just be as simple as a question: am I eating enough? So definitely. Some of our teams will come in August for preseason. So this is where I will really be able to work with their freshmen a little bit closer in their teams. And my approach really with everybody is I don't want to preach at anyone. I look at my job as an educator and just as always providing education and a safe space to have conversation and be open-minded about different things. So typically we will give athletes snippets of information, maybe a 10 to 15 minute talk at the most, because that's really all they can handle at the time. That's how most of us actually right now, I feel like attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. So instead of sitting up there with a PowerPoint and just droning on and on for an hour, it's more effective to meet with them multiple times in shorter stints. I'm a big believer in you have to show up. This is really just more anecdotal for me personally. If somebody just showed up at the championship game and said okay, you need to do this, this, and this, I'd be like, get out of here. Where were you, when it was 1,000 degrees on the turf and we were, sweating, or where were you in the rain or the cold or on the water, wherever it is. You can't just show up, at the last minute and think you're going to come in and save the day. That to me is the wrong approach. I think you need to be visible from the beginning. you need to show up at practices. Maybe you can't be there, and a lot of times I can't be there for the whole practice, but I will come out to practice. And if you have a good rapport with coaches, they incorporate you into that. Hey, in the huddle at the end or in the beginning, or
Sure.
even in the middle. I've had coaches stop practice and just say, "Hey, Andrea, how are you? Do you want to talk to the team?" I've had people do that, which is really generous because coaches, and as a former coach, I can say this, we're very, we really like our time. But so my approach is just constantly to be present. As much as I possibly can, make connections. If it's possible to travel, even if it's a day trip, that's important because and this as an athlete and as somebody that's a recruiter, it's those little moments, that something funny happens, that's how you build a bond. And really my job is a lot of trust because we're talking about sometimes really sensitive issues.
Sure.
Weight is a sensitive issue. Health, nutrition, these are personal, sensitive topics. And for me, building that trust and that rapport with not only the coaching staff and the performance staff, but with the athletes is really, really crucial.
Yeah, I think trust is really, really important because to a certain degree, you have to you have to talk about things that can make people feel vulnerable, right? And vulnerability is not necessarily a good thing that athletes like to show.
No.
Right? Whether it's a nagging injury that they're dealing with, something that's going on emotionally in their lives, right? And so trust building, I think relationship building is one of the most important things.
Yes.
That we have to do as not we in the same profession, but people that work with student athletes. Myself, in the perspective of teaching courses to some of these students, right? Is
Yes.
You want them to trust and approach you when they're having an issue and know that you're going to help them through that. You might not solve it perfectly because, right, you're providing a lot of information, but really thinking about how do I get this person who maybe is disengaged to now care about what it is that we're preaching and how that's going to translate to the field or the court or whatever type of venue that the sport is occurring in. I think that's really, really important. And I've noticed that there's a level of maturity that jumps from sophomore to junior year. Freshman and sophomore, they're still just trying to figure it out. I have seen people that are freshmen that are very mature and immediately. But I've noticed the biggest jump for most around junior year, where there's a level of ownership.
Yes.
Behind
Agreed.
what you're providing them and intake. So I guess from that perspective, how do you overcome challenges where maybe a student doesn't, I don't want to say listen, but because at the end of the day, you're providing information to them and they have to make the decision of what they're actually going to be eating. But how do you overcome difficult situations where a student really is maybe undernourished and, you start to have concerns about, well, this is going to affect your performance, right? And maybe for a while they're young enough, they have youth on their side where they're able to bounce back to that. Yep. But that's not something that's sustainable for the long term. So you talk a little bit about how you go through that and how you help students with those
Sure.
issues.
Yeah, sure. So part of the job too is being able to figure out, is this an education issue or is this a psychological issue?
Sure.
Because if there are psychological barriers, I could sit there and educate all day, and the person, maybe if it's somebody that's under fueling and there's some sort of disordered eating or eating disorder even, they're just tuning me out. Right. So I could sit there all day and say, you need this, this, and this. We could get so individualized, but they can't take that in. They can't take that information in and process it and utilize it because of some other psychological barrier issue or whatever. So in that case, I would recommend, and we would talk through that and we would approach it as, with the rest of the team. So I would probably refer them over to counseling. Okay. And I would talk them through that about, and maybe not just straight up hey, you need counseling for this, but, it just, and a lot of times this is the truth. It's you're seeming where you're having a lot of either hesitation or, talk to me more. And I try to give them the space to talk it out a little bit more. And usually the person is willing to go, they recognize that there's something off, because usually at that point there may be like, recurring injury, or maybe there's they've noticed something in themselves, or whatever it may be. So we refer, in that case, I would refer out to our counseling and work with counseling. Still not, I wouldn't drop that student, but support them in a way where when they were ready to come back and accept the information in terms of education and what they need, then I would work with them in that way. If it's just a strictly an education, and we don't have too many student athletes that are like, no, I'm just not going to listen to you.
Right.
Or at least they don't say that to my face. I have had athletes, if we're talking even about like hydration, I had one athlete that, for so long, she would not stay hydrated and she just wouldn't take it seriously. And then her senior year came, and she took it seriously, because it was like that's just when she was able to, I guess, either, I don't know whether it's be mature enough or just realize that this is my last season or whatever it is, and really put everything forward. And then she started hydrating, and she was like, oh my gosh, why wasn't I doing this before? And we would like laugh about it. That like she just wasn't ready to accept the information. So my job is to just support them, meet them where they're at. I mean, as long as they're being safe, and just keep reiterating and educating our staff, educating our coaches, educating the athlete in different ways and different messaging about like why underfueling is going to be a problem, because you're going to see this, and this. If you're underfueling, you're not going to be able to perform in your sport, but you're not going to be able to perform in the classroom, because you're going to be exhausted. You're not fueling your brain. You're not fueling your body. And when we start talking about some of the effects of underfueling, sometimes it starts to click like, yeah, I am so exhausted. I mean, one of the biggest questions I ask when somebody comes in to see me is, how's your energy?
Sure.
Tell me what your energy is like. What's it like in the first thing in the morning? What's it like midday? What's it like at the end of the day? So, and then a lot of the job too is asking questions and providing space and holding space in a very non-judgmental way, and just really stating facts, or saying, hey, we looked at the polar data.
Right.
And you're burning X amount of, calories, and we did your, 3-day, 4-day food log, and multiple days you're missing, whether it's overall calories, carbs, usually it's carbs, whatever it may be. And we talk about that and trying to use objective data as opposed to, well, I just think whatever,
Yeah, that's really helpful, because I think there's a lot of people, I've seen it on the clinical side of things more so, where, like if you're not, there's a book by Peter Drucker called The Effective Executive. And there's a really important quote. There's one quote that I really always really live my life by, and it's what gets tracked gets managed, right? And the idea, right? So if you don't know, like you eat a sandwich and you don't know, like you just look at that as like, okay, I ate a sandwich today, right? Okay, that's a tangible, categorical thing, right? And then that sandwich includes, carbohydrates from the bread. You've got, if you get lettuce, tomato, protein, right? Is it a fattier protein like salami, or if it's something that's leaner, maybe something like turkey, So that's one thing I'm really interested in a lot, is looking at these food that we eat and sort of realizing, okay, like that food, I've ate that before, that is enough. Like when I look at that, like how much is enough? And I think there's a little bit of disconnect between the average consumer and definitely probably, I would imagine, student athletes that you work with, in terms of like, well, I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and, I feel okay. And they don't necessarily equate that, like the sandwich plus the apple that goes with it might actually provide a closer approximation of the fuel you actually need to perform, you know? And so they're like, oh, I wasn't hungry for the apple, but
Right.
So it's just kind of, it's interesting because I see a disconnect in the real world, and I don't know what the solution is, right? But to your point, tracking and knowing whether or not you are hydrated, right?
But tracking to a point, because then we can also cause other issues if we're like track the whole time. So you can go a whole other way if somebody is on the verge of disordered eating disorder, of tracking, over tracking. For what purpose? I mean, I think it serves a purpose, and you have to, as a practitioner, you have to figure out what, who's able to do that. Because I've actually talked to people, student athletes, and I've said, is this going to trigger you if you track this? And we've had, when we've built the rapport and we've gotten to that point in our work together, I know there's some people I can say, is this going to trigger you, or are you okay doing this? Sometimes I don't, depending on the athlete, I might say, I'm not going to give you your range. I'm just going to tell you you're not hitting it.
Gotcha.
Like, I won't give them hard numbers. Some people really want the numbers, and that's okay. And some people shouldn't have the numbers quite yet. I mean, it's ultimately their information. So I would always offer it and give it to them, but I would state it in a way of like, I don't know if you necessarily need that, or I would just start off in more of a general ranges. And then if they do ask, you know, maybe we don't need to really delve into that too much. Let's just add, instead of saying, you know, you need to add X amount of grams of carb, I would say, why don't you add, okay, let's look at the snacks that you like to have. Let's add this snack to whatever it is, or this food item or beverage even, to your breakfast, or your snacks, or your lunches, or your nighttime meal, or your dinner, or whatever it is. That sometimes is a better approach, when you can just keep things simple for athletes too, is also important, I think, because they have so many things, especially our Drexel student athletes. I have to really give them a shout out, because we are on a quarter system.
Yep.
It is really difficult to learn what you would learn in, 16 weeks in 10?
It's truncated, It's collapsed into 10 weeks.
Yeah, and then be a student athlete. I mean, student athletes in general, it's really hard. So if we can really keep things simple. So I agree with you in terms of tracking, but I think you have to be careful. Like, there's a time and a place for it.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It really is. Like, I go back to it's a sweet science. It's not, there's what you learn, you know, from both your coursework as well as what you practice and what you see, what works and doesn't work. And where tracking can be really good for one athlete in one circumstance, another athlete that is struggling with some kind of disordered eating, that would be a trigger. You know, I would actually be counterproductive to do that for them. So
right, and think about it even yourself. Like, you may know this, but maybe some of the people listening don't. Do you know how many what your plate would look like if I just said to you, you need to eat 1,200 calories or 1,800 calories?
Right.
Of what? Snickers bars, beef jerky, pasta. I mean, the USOC has come up with this really great, they took the My Plate and they call it the athlete's plate. And it's something I utilize as a tool. Most sports dietitians utilize this. So it shows you, like, on a hard training day, and it defines what that is. So it shows you, like, half your plate has to be carbs, and it's in a picture form. So I do try to, like I said, there are times that I will use ranges and counting, maybe more of like individualized programming, or, you know, to reach whatever goal that may be. But in general, I try not to get our athletes hung up on the numbers.
Gotcha.
Just bigger picture of, like, basics. You need to have ideally breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and a nighttime snack, like, in addition to a pre and post workout snacks. So it's almost like 4 meals essentially, plus pre and post. Most of them aren't getting it. And if you even take a step further, when our freshmen come in, they're really confused, because one of the things I'm really finding, and I'm very interested in, and I don't know how to correct the problem, to be really truthful. So anybody out there knows how to correct this problem, email me.
Definitely.
when you look at, because sometimes I don't work with a lot of high school athletes or middle school athletes, but when you look at a high schooler and how their day is structured, so, they're getting up pretty early. They're probably at school at 7:30. So most of them are not getting up and like you see on TV, have like eggs and cereal and pancake and bacon and the orange juice. They're not eating like that. If they're eating at all, it's something, who knows, it might just be some orange juice or water, granola bar. Then they're in school and the lunch is at like 10:30, 11 o'clock. It's 20 minutes. And then they're in classes pretty much the rest of the day. And then for athletes, they have to go train. So
On top of that. So then they're training. So they might eat something beforehand. They might not. And then they're going to go home and they're going to binge because they're starving. So you're talking about growing bodies. So people that are not just, take sport out of it. These are individuals who are growing and need X amount of nutrients to grow and support growth. And then you add in the whole activity factor. And most of these kids are playing high school and they're playing club. They're a multi-sport athlete. They're going to a trainer. And they're tournaments all weekend. I mean, who's teaching them how to eat? Right.
Who's teaching them this? Who's teaching them nutrition? Who's working with the families and the parents and the school systems? I mean, it's almost like a systemic issue.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to fix it because not everybody's going to be an athlete either. But let's say you were going to go do art after school or be in the play or whatever it is, you still. We know we need, food is fuel and it's energy. So we need that and we should be in these good practices. So sometimes what I've really noticed over the past couple of years is that I see kids, the freshmen come in, freshman athletes I'm speaking about, and they were probably like the best of the best in their high school. So their nutrition really didn't maybe have much of a difference because they were the best of the best. And even on their club teams, they were probably still some of the best of the best. And now they're here and they're competing for spots. They're in a quarter system, which is just, tests are week 2 and 3, already.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to eat and they don't know when to eat. And they're just used to not eating before a practice or not having a recovery.
Not speaking for everybody, but mom and dad might have been the one cooking for you and buying the groceries and all of those things.
It was for me. I mean, my parents were great. I mean, my main name is Grasso, so I had both my parents cooked, and there was, so it was a big transition in like everything. Even for me, I think about all of that, and then I look at the students we have now, and they're just so much. I feel like they're just so much busier, and their life is so much more hectic. And then you add in all the influencers and the TikToks and the detoxes and the nonsense and the diets and eat like this and look like that. It is a lot.
Right.
It is a lot. And what are we doing to make it better for not even just student athletes, but just students in middle school and high school? How are we helping them eat better and have better eating patterns so that we don't have disordered eating or leading into eating disorders when they're adults?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, not just athletes. I mean, I work with athletes, so I see it in this population, but everybody.
Yeah. I mean, even people who work, some people thinking about how to reframe. Like there's athletes in the context of sport, right? I consider myself an athlete, a recreational athlete for what I do for training outside of work. But for a while, even like people who work in the the emergency room of hospitals, these docs,
for sure,
their body is taxed.
They're on their feet all day.
Nurses. They are athletes in a different capacity.
Yes, nurses. I mean, rarely, I mean, I worked in a hospital. I saw those nurses work so hard. I mean, they're not just sitting there like playing cards at the nurses station and eating goodies. I mean, they're tracking 5, 6 patients.
Lucky if they're peeing once a shift.
Correct. And getting in enough fluid and hydrating themselves properly. I mean, it's, nutrition at its basics, I don't think as a society we're very good at.
Right.
So then when you add something like any type of physical activity, whether it's sport or, a very taxing job,
there's needs there too.
There's needs there too.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's really interesting. It's a very interesting concept to me, and I'm just seeing it more and more, and I'm realizing that this is why some of our athletes are getting injured, or we see injuries, or
Sure.
how, and I don't know how to correct the problem.
I think it comes down to awareness.
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes down, I mean, I don't know the answer, by the way, but I
Yeah.
think to a certain degree it comes down to being aware, not having an ego where you're willing to accept the information. I think that's a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see this a lot in personal training where like somebody like for example, like a lot of people that are certified in exercise, like if they go to a gym and they sign up at a gym and they have to do a first workout with a trainer, I don't need that, right? I'm a trainer myself, right? So there's like sort of that thing.
Mm-hmm.
So to be humble enough that you can always get better, all of us can get better.
Yes.
And to trust people who have the knowledge, the experience, the credentials to take us from where we are today and where we want to be in the future. And I think the one thing is that strikes me with you, specifically, Andrea, is patience. You have to be patient with the athlete.
Mm-hmm.
You were patient when you were going through your master's program. Is being patient to, as we say in Philly, and the Sixers are in the playoffs right now, trust the process, right?
Yes.
Trust the process, take the advice, receive the education. And one of the things that I always sort of think about is if somebody ever came to me and said, hey, I took your advice and it didn't work. So then the first thing I say is, well, did you really take the advice? Did you really take the education and apply it? Or did you do ish, which is you did your version of it, which is not exactly what is evidence-based sometimes. So it's really interesting, and you got a very tough job. We're getting close to the end of time, but I guess just before we're finishing up, this hour flew by.
Yeah, it did.
Really thinking about, so I guess for maybe a student that is an athlete or a student who is maybe a student at the school who would like to start exercising and becoming healthier and start thinking a little bit more intentionally, I think, in terms of like, how can I eat a little bit better, and where can they, I'll tell you about that after. Where can you, where can people find you for student athletes that maybe haven't met with you on a day-to-day basis? And then for students who want to maybe say, I would really love this, but I'm not a student athlete, who is the resource on campus that people can connect and maybe
it's a great questions. Awareness is great, and even just check-ins of like, am I doing the right thing? I think is really helpful. So student athletes know they can get to me. So my office is over in the DAC. Well, it's really on the rec center side, but I primarily see just our student athletes.
Yeah.
And I'm not doing it completely by myself because I do have student help and interns and fellows and things like that. So it's not 100% by myself, but then in addition to, if you are a non-athlete and you're here, you can email, and I'll put, maybe can put it in the notes.
Sure, absolutely.
Nutrition appointments here at Drexel, and we can set you up with a dietitian to have a one-on-one consultation. And usually, most insurances are accepted, so we can walk you through that process.
Very cool. Well, Andrea, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
We'll
definitely have you on again in the future because we could have talked about a lot of other things.
Yes. Please.
But we try to keep these around an hour-ish, people on their commutes home and whatnot.
Yeah.
And but this has been awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. We appreciate it, and we'll definitely have you back soon.
Thank you.
Take care.